Japan up close.
In terms of the question of what kind of support does Japan currently provide to the African continent, I think it's useful to make 2 points here. The first point is that we need to recognize that Japan is actually a long-time or long-standing partner and supporter of African development. Japan's official development assistance to Africa started back in 1966. So that's almost 6 decades ago. It's 57 years this year. And since the 1970s, so also for a substantial period of time, sub-Saharan Africa has received about, on a consistent basis, about 10% of Japan's global ODA. So these are large sums of money that had been provided by Japan over an extended period of time, over a number of decades, as I said, almost 6 decades. And when we look at the pledges that were made at TICAD 8, which was held, TICAD is the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, and the 8th TICAD was held in Tunisia in August 2022, last year. There, the Japanese government and Japanese partners undertook to provide around $30 billion of assistance to the African continent. So the first point is that there's a long time partnership and many years and vast amounts of money actually of support by Japan to the African continent. The second point is that one should look at this support in terms of what's the nature of the support. So what is it composed of? And I think Japan is distinctive from many other major donors, aid donors to the African continent in the wide-ranging nature and diversity of Japanese support to the continent. So traditionally, Japan has been a big provider of ODA, official development assistance, as I've said, and that's been in terms of in the form of grants, in the form of technical cooperation and loan financing. A lot of that loan financing went for major infrastructure development on the African continent. And now, in more recent years, the more modern variants of support that we're seeing coming from Japan to the African continent, in addition to traditional ODA, it's also blended, what one can call blended financing. So that is public and private sector money coming from Japan and supporting a variety of development initiatives on the African continent. So that's in the form of aid, non-concessional assistance, and as well as investments. And then also with the Africa Rising discourse that we've had over the past 15 years, we've seen the Japanese private sector actually step up and step into the African continent in a significant way, So in terms of providing investments or greenfield investments, brownfield investments, becoming involved in major mergers and acquisitions, and so on. So to answer then that question about what is the nature of the support, there is involvement in many different ways of Japanese capital in Africa's political economy. Through ODA, there's been support in sectors such as health, education, water and sanitation. Through blended financing, there's been support for major infrastructure development on the African continent. And increasingly, as I've said, we're seeing investments being the private sector looking towards the African continent as a place for investments. Just to illustrate or to substantiate that point I made about investments, at TICAD 8, again, to reference TICAD 8, one of the new ways in which the Japanese private sector stepped in was to pledge a financing fund of around 10 billion yen to finance startups on the African continent. So all of these are one should recognize as significant means of involvement and support for development. Your question was also about what's the impact, the real impact on African people. Now, one can only answer that question if you do systematic, quantitative impact assessments, and there are organizations and agencies like JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself that do these impact assessments. So we have that kind of database to say that, to be in a position to say that there's been impact or no impact. And I think that one can say that there has been impact. If I could reference some studies that were done after TICAD 7, so that was after the TICAD conference held in 2019, then there had been some positive impacts. For example, the studies after TICAD 7 showed that 23,000 people on the African continent were trained in healthcare as a consequence of Japan's TICAD conference, and that up to 6 million children on the African continent were reached with TICAD-channeled support for primary education in Africa and so on. So in a quantitative sense, then, one can find evidence for that there is impact. But I think one should also think about this question of impact in a maybe more abstract, maybe more qualitative way. And then the question becomes, would the African continent have been better or worse off if there had not been any support from Japan? And here I think it's again interesting and important to understand that Japanese support is quite distinctive compared to other maybe, let's say, Western donors. So there are many unique characteristics and features of Japanese development support, not only to Africa but in terms of all of Japan's global ODA. But let me just talk about the African context. So we've had many decades of technical cooperation where experts and scientists and people who are really very knowledgeable about specific things such as health and sanitation, these sorts of experts had been dispatched to the African continent. We have many, in different parts of the African continent, agricultural demonstration centers. So there's been that kind of scientific expertise to provide assistance in very focused, targeted areas such as health and education. So one can argue that that has, in a qualitative way, has improved the lives of people. Then also what makes Japanese support unique is it's things such as Kaizen Training Institute. So the Kaizen, it's this philosophy of continuous improvement. We have in Ethiopia, in Zambia, in South Africa, and a number of other African countries, we have these training institutes. Another is some projects that's based on the philosophy of monozukuri. I think I pronounce it okay, which is combining the science and the art and the craft of making products to an excellent standard. So we have many examples on the African continent where you've got these sorts of projects of support that from Japan. And then lastly, infrastructure development, which is that's the big need. There are many needs on the African continent, many needs in terms of development, but infrastructure, there's a big deficit as far as infrastructure availability in Africa is concerned. And Japan has been a big financer and a big supporter of major infrastructure investments and development, alongside partners like the World Bank and some other multilateral lenders. So yes, Africa is a young and dynamic continent. In fact, it was very striking to me the words of Prime Minister Kishida at TICAD 8 in his opening speech at TICAD 8 last year. He made exactly that point. He said that Africa is young and vibrant in terms of and has a lot of potential, and that Japan wants to be a partner with Africa going forward. So there's lots of potential, given that we have a particular demographic on the continent, and we have so many young people. But to be honest, the youth can't do it alone. The youth need us, the adults, to create for them an enabling environment in order to realize their potential. So what does that enabling environment need? And what do the youth need to realize their potential? It's education and investment in education, skills training, and importantly, political and social stability. And then also looking at climate change and the major threat that climate change has, especially for Africa. It is for the adults on the African continent, the people in leadership positions, the people in government positions, the people who mentor the youth. It's for us to take the right decisions and to take the right actions towards environmental protection in balance with economic growth. So to answer your question, it is the adult generation of now of Africa must act now to leave the next generation with options for their development. So that relates very much to what we had been talking about prior, what the impact of Japan's support has been, what one can say has been the impact of Japanese support on the real lives of people on the African continent. And I did mention some examples where we do have data and evidence of how people are reached through ODA, especially in training and being trained, how people are being reached, children are being reached in that they get more opportunities to attend schools, so primary education, health and sanitation. And then from TICAD 8, that pledge of $30 billion US dollars, it follows it's a big amount of money. So that's something to definitely take notice of, but it follows again a long-standing pattern of support, also within the framework of TICAD, the whole TICAD process over its entire lifespan. So the theme of TICAD 8 was society, economy, and peace and stability for Africa. Those were the three main pillars that were themed as TICAD 8. But those pillars have been consistent. They were also part of TICAD 7, were part of TICAD 6, part of TICAD 5, and so on. So that's that pattern that has been there for a long time, and that's been consistent over the TICAD lifespan. I think what stands out from TICAD 8 and the pledges made at TICAD 8 by the Japanese government is that there are some innovations some new things. For example, $4 billion for Japan's Green Growth Initiative for Africa. And that is to facilitate structural transition towards decarbonized economies on the African continent. So that's speaking to the agenda of mitigating climate change and the impact of climate change. It's supposed to finance investments in renewable energy projects, geothermal power generation, and financing research into green hydrogen and green ammonia. So that's a new spurt of energy and a new spurt of capital in an important area for the future, both for Africa and for Japan. Then I mentioned already from our prior discussion with TICAD 8 as well, there was the pledge of 10 billion yen, Japanese yen, from the Japanese private sector. Keizai Doyokai, the Japan Association of Corporate Executives. That's also a new aspect that came out of TICAD 8. It was already discussed at TICAD 7, but the pledge was made at TICAD 8. So another innovation that focuses on financing startups on the African continent. And startups are an interesting aspect to support because who gets involved in startups? It tends to be, well, it's entrepreneurs. It tends to be younger people as well. People who see gaps or identify niches and then go for that. So this financing of startups speaks to the potential that lies in the youth of the African continent. And then TICAD 8, they're also at TICAD 8, the Japanese government and private sector made pledges to support capacity building in dealing with climate change and disaster risk mitigation training. Another new or another important focus of attention that's important for the future going forward. So TICAD 8, therefore, one will only be able to see, what the outcome of TICAD 8 is or the impact of TICAD 8 is a few years down the line. It takes some time for these projects to be implemented, for training to be provided and so forth. But TICAD 8, I think, has a number of important areas that are future-oriented, looking towards the future. I think, in a word, a relationship of mutual trust, mutual respect, and genuine partnership. Let me unpack that. I think that there has been a relationship of partnership between Africa and Japan, in that Japan has been supporting or trying to support African development for so many decades. And Japan never did that on its own. It always did that in consultation and in partnership with African governments, with the African Union, and with regional organizations on the African continent, as well as with other international partners and international organizations. So that partnership, which has a long history, should be further leveraged and further built on, expanded on. And I think TICAD 8, the sorts of direction that TICAD 8 seems to suggest in terms of being future-oriented, I think that's quite important. And then also, given the geopolitical environment that we are currently experiencing, and the changes we're seeing in geopolitics and in international order, I think we will also see, in terms of diplomacy, another element of partnership, and that would be strategic partnership. Now, with strategic partnership in diplomatic terms, these are formats of engagement, whether it's on a bilateral basis or multilateral basis, where states use a range of diplomatic and institutional arrangements to pursue joint or common interests in the international arena. And the purpose of these strategic partnerships is to deepen relationships, to mitigate perceived international risks, and to share international burdens and costs. So I think Japan, going forward in its diplomacy, will also be looking towards developing some strategic partnerships in the diplomatic realm with some key African states. South Africa is the only state, the only government, the only country on the African continent so far where there is a formal comprehensive strategic agreement between Japan and South Africa. But I think that this way of making partnership might be considered in more serious terms by Japan with many more other African countries going forward. It's a very interesting and complex question. So Africa is a large continent. It's a diverse continent. We have 54 sovereign territorial states, all independent politically. There's regional diversity, there's social diversity, and there's cultural diversity. And there's also diversity in terms of geographical resources and economic capacities. So any projection about population expansion, demographic changes, and so forth will not unfold uniformly across the African continents. And different African countries will be better capacitated economically, culturally as well, to deal with rapid social change, rapid population change, and rapid economic change as well, and others not. But the African countries face common challenges, and I think maybe one of the most important ones or starkest ones is climate change. Climate change affects the entire globe, all countries in the world, but climate change is affecting Africa disproportionately because we already have a number of vulnerable societies, vulnerable communities, and the impacts of climate change then just become more exacerbated. They multiply when you have these existing vulnerabilities. So we're seeing the risk of climate change refugees. There's the possibility of resource conflicts, water conflicts, and so on. So that means that all of these risks, as well as the potential, creates conditions of uncertainty and creates conditions of unpredictability, which is difficult for any country, not let alone an African country, but for any government to respond to these sorts of volatility and unpredictability. So I think, given all of that, it's asking what should the international community also be doing to be in partnership with the African continent, and where the international community also undertake to address some of the inequities that the African continent is still subject to, and I'm thinking in concretely, for example, in terms of the potential ramifications of climate change. So what does that mean in terms of international agreements to mitigate the risk of very negative fallouts from climate change? And then secondly, it means it underlines the importance of cooperation, international cooperation. Of course, cooperation among African countries, so continental cooperation, but the international community should also be partners in that kind of cooperation.
Japan up close.